It's our 20th lesson on fundamentals of the faith, and we will introduce and begin the study of the Sabbath. And I believe 2 parts on the Sabbath, 2 lessons on this. We'll finish the study of the Sabbath next week, Lord willing. What is the Sabbath? Question. What was entailed in keeping the Sabbath day? We won't answer that. Let the Bible answer it, of course. There are various doctrines on the Sabbath. There are some false doctrines. We want to refute them or show the error of the doctrines. Has the Sabbath always been kept? Some claim it's been kept from the Garden of Eden on. Is that true? Was the Sabbath observed from the creation? Genesis 2:2-3, for example. Made by some. We'll try to deal with that question. There's a great amount of confusion on this subject in the religious world today. And we need to know the truths in order to be able to teach those who are in error so that we might convert them, hopefully, and get them to become obedient to the gospel and become Christians. I'll define some terms and give an introduction to it now. First, we'll begin with lexical definitions. Remember, a lexicon is a dictionary, specialized dictionary. In our case, we're going to use lexicons for both the Hebrew and the English lexicons and the Greek and the English lexicons. And these lexicons will be from the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament. The Hebrew and part of the Old Testament was written in Chaldean language, Aramaic. But we will not be looking at any passages in Aramaic. The Hebrew word Shabbat is a day of rest of heart. Brown Driver Briggs Gesenius Lexicon, Hebrew and English Lexicon. Hebrew and Chaldean and English Lexicon, page 992. The Greek word Sabbaton is the 7th day of each week, which was a sacred festival on which the Israelites are required to abstain from all work. Thayer's definition is not totally complete. It's true, it's accurate as far as it goes, but it's not totally complete. We'll see as we develop this a little further. Webster defines the words. Now, if we use Webster's English dictionary, he defines words as they're commonly used, not necessarily as the Bible defines them. So we need to be careful of that using a dictionary, a modern dictionary. Because if the word is incorrectly used by society, then that definition will be found in the dictionary. That is, when I say incorrectly used, if it's incorrectly used and contrary to or not the same as what how the Bible uses the word. So we always have to be aware of that when we're studying the scriptures using a contemporary dictionary, such as our English dictionary. If one were Spanish, the Spanish dictionary might not define the Bible words exactly the way the Bible defines them. Same would occur in Telugu or other languages, German, Russian, French, whatever language one might be speaking, Chinese or whatever, and the various dialects of Chinese. What is the Sabbath now? What is it? Sabbath day was a day of rest. He says, 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath unto Jehovah thy God. And if thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy strangers from thy gates. He lays it out pretty clearly. Nobody is to be working. Your animals are not to be working. They'll get a day of rest. So right here then, he lays out, and this is the 6 days that they're to work. The 7th day would be the 7th day of the week. The Sabbath day then is the 7th day, of the week. That's the Sabbath day of the week, Sabbath. There are other Sabbaths in the Bible. Keep this in mind. And we'll lay some others out as we develop this more fully. Hey, what day of the week was the Sabbath on? We've already seen it's on the seventh day of the week. There were also Sabbath years, and that would be every seventh year. Now, under this situation, speak of the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land, which I give you, which I give you, and say unto them, come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto Jehovah. It's going to keep a Sabbath. The land gets to rest. Now, if we go back to the seventh day of the week, we'll see the people are resting, the animals are resting, and now in the seventh year, the land rests. Now in farming, they call that the land lie fallow, F-A-L-L-O-W, or F-A-L-L-O-W, I think that's spelled, yes. Let it lie fallow and not grow crops on it. And of course, whenever you do this, some of the seed will have fallen off the wheat plants and other plants, barley or whatever they had growing on the land, and it would spring up of themselves and grow. There would be some that would grow. The fruit trees would keep on producing their fruit. And in this situation, that seventh year, the poor people, the widows, the orphans, and the poor people that had no property, they got to harvest what it was in the field and in the vineyards and orchards. It was theirs to harvest. And they got everything that was in it. God promised the children of Israel, you can look at this more fully, but in the sixth year, if they would keep that Sabbath year, that he'd make sure their crops were sufficient to carry them over 2 years. They'd get a great harvest in that sixth year so as to carry them over to the seventh year, to the eighth year, back to the first year after the Sabbath. Year 8. Year 7 was the Sabbath year. Years thou shalt sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruits thereof. But in the seventh year shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land. So now the land gets a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath unto Jehovah. Thou shalt neither sow thy field nor prune thy vineyard. You prune a vineyard, an orchard, and prune your vineyard, and the grapes will produce better. But they'll produce without being pruned. They just don't produce as well. And so he's saying, you don't do any work on the land. You get a year of rest from your labors. And so the people would get a rest. They still had to cook their food and they had to store their grain and store everything. And they could actually go out and buy the crops that were harvested by the widows and orphans and poor people. And who got the crops, they could buy crops from them if they wanted to, fresh vegetables, for example, fresh fruit. Any questions there? So the land rested in the seventh year. Each seventh year was a Sabbath year. So the Jews counted their time by 7-year cycles. That's significant in interpretation of the Bible. We in the United States, we go by decades. Every 10-year period, we go by decades, or time cycles. But they went in 7-year cycles because they had Sabbath years. And that's very critical to interpreting the 9th chapter of the book of Daniel, where it says weeks. It has the word weeks in the King James Version, but it's actually 70 of them. And that's 490 years. And that's the time period they had not observed the Sabbath years for the sake of the poor people. If you study it more carefully, you'll see that the poor people were supposed to get the land every 7th year, and for 70 Sabbath years, they hadn't been doing it, getting it. So that's 490 years. And that figures in an interpretation of Daniel chapter 9. And of course, this is also told to us by the prophet Jeremiah. And there's another passage in, I think it's the last chapter of Chronicles that has it in there as well. But what the problem was, they had not been observing the Sabbath, and that's one of the reasons they lost their land. That and a number of other sins. And the poor people were to get that land. And when the Babylonians come and took them, they left the poor people. And the poor people were promised by God through Jeremiah the prophet that they would get that land for 70 years. So the poor people were going to get 70 years of Sabbath years that the poor people had not been given. They'd get to have the land for 70 years all by themselves. And what they did is the poor people were so afraid they didn't trust Jeremiah's word, God's prophet. So they took off after the governor was killed by an Ishmaelite, and they took off and fled down to Egypt, and there they were consumed. But they could have had that land and had their Sabbath years, all 70 of them at one time. But they didn't have enough faith to get it. But let's move on. The land rested in the 7th year of the Sabbath year. Shout number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years, and there shall be unto thee the days of 7 Sabbaths of years, even 40 and 9 years. Now then, the next year was the year of Jubilee, the 50th year. So the Jubilee, all the debts were canceled, the land went back to its original owners, and any person in servitude was freed. Okay. This was a very good law, and it worked quite well. But anyhow, they weren't keeping it. It was entailed in the Sabbath day, in the keeping of the Sabbath day. Now, we had the Sabbath years in Leviticus 25. There was no food preparation to be done on the Sabbath day. You can't make your wife work and go ahead and do the cooking. The cooking was done on the day before. So they learned how to prepare food without refrigeration that would keep for a couple of days. They didn't have refrigerators like we have in the United States. Let's read this. And he said unto them, this is that which Jehovah hath spoken. Tomorrow is a solemn rest, a holy Sabbath unto Jehovah. Bake that which you will bake, and boil that which you will boil, and all that reigneth over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. So cook your food and have it for the next day. So, but they weren't to work on the Sabbath day. At home. See, for that Jehovah hath given you the Sabbath, therefore he giveth you of the 6th day the bread of 2 days. And so you cook enough for 2 days, and abide ye every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the Sabbath day. Don't go out and travel around. So everybody was to take that day to rest. And that's good for your body and good for your mind, to take a day off and rest. That's a good thing. There was no work to be done. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath unto Jehovah thy God, or Yahweh thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy strangers from thy gates. Now the word cattle is livestock. That would include the donkeys and the other animals, camels and other animals that they might have, whatever they had. So they were, and even a stranger, somebody who's living there, that's living in your land, is not to work, not to let him work, to have him to work. Sabbath breaking was punishable by death. Ye shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy unto you. Everyone that profaneth it shall be put to death. For whosoever doeth any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. So they're cut off. Even to kindle a fire. You shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations upon the Sabbath day. I don't know how that would have worked if it had automatic systems that will turn on with thermostats like we have in the United States. The system would turn on automatically. Various doctrines on the Sabbath. Now we see what's all is involved in truly keeping the Sabbath, and those who claim to keep the Sabbath don't keep it. They don't do all these things. Various doctrines. Has the Sabbath always been kept? Well, the claim in Exodus 31, 16, and 17 that it was perpetual covenant. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual generation. Now, that sounds like it's going to last forever. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. So it's a sign between me and the children of Israel, not for other people. See, it was a sign for them. Now, if you made the word perpetual last forever, it would only still be for the Jews, for the children of Israel. It wouldn't be for anybody else. But the word perpetual, in the context of all the places it's used, has to be defined by the context, as this is the case. Let me read on. We'll come back to it in just a minute. It's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days, the Lord, or Jehovah, or Yahweh, better translated, made heaven and earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed. So we see the perpetual covenant. Now, the Passover was perpetual. Let's see it. It's perpetual as well. And this day shall be unto you for a memorial. You shall keep it at a feast to Jehovah throughout your generations, see? As long as you're functioning under the Old Testament, see? Throughout your generations, you shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever, see? All the time that you're in your generations, that you are under the law of Moses. That's what it's talking about. Context. The incense was burnt to be burned perpetually. When Aaron lighteth the lamps at even, he shall burn it, a perpetual incense before Jehovah throughout your generations. Throughout the time that they were a nation and they were under the Old Testament, the law of Moses, they were to continue to burn this incense. They were to continue to observe the Sabbath. They would continue to observe the Passover. Offerings were perpetual. It shall be a continual burnt offering throughout your generations. At the door of the tent of meeting before Jehovah, where I will meet with you to speak there unto thee. Now, here's the thing. If the word perpetual means forever and ever, throughout your generations, a continual burnt offering, a perpetual burnt offering, if that's to be the case, then we must be offering burnt offerings today. But if we study the book of Hebrews, we say going back to offer burnt offerings of animal sacrifices is a rejection of the perfect sacrifice of Jesus. And so that won't fit. We can't do that. And so we know that interpretation of the meaning of that word is wrong because of that. These were perpetual as long as the law of Moses was in effect. That's what that's saying. Was the Sabbath observed from the creation? Well, Genesis 2:2 says, and on the 7th day, God finished his work which he had made and rested. Now, the word rested doesn't mean God was tired. And, as something can come to rest, we can say an object can be moving and come to rest. What does that mean? It rested. It came to rest. It stopped working. It stopped doing something. In this case, God finished his work which he had made, and he rested. He stopped creating. That's all that means. On the seventh day from all his work which he had made. So he rested. He ceased to do the work. He ceased to create. The creation was finished. That's all that means. God didn't get tired. He is infinite in power. And God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because that in it he rested from all his late work. He had finished his work. So he rested, stopped creating, and so he told man to do this as well. And all this work which God had created and made, he ceased. God made known the Sabbath, however, at Sinai. The Sabbath keeping began at Sinai. All right. Deuteronomy 5:2, he says, the Lord our God, Jehovah, Yahweh our God, made a covenant with us in Horeb. Horeb is a place where Mount Sinai was. Jehovah made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us here, all of us here alive this day. So it's with all of us who are here alive this day. Now, wait a second. He didn't make it with who? Didn't make it with our fathers. And it's looking back to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob is what he's talking about in that context. That covenant wasn't made with them. This covenant was not made with those patriarchs. They were under the patriarchal law, not the law of Moses. Verse 15, let's see. We'll skip down to verse 15. And thou shalt remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt, and Jehovah, Yahweh, the Lord thy God, brought thee out of the land thence by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, Jehovah thy God commandeth thee to keep the Sabbath day. Because he brought you out of Egypt, he commanded you to keep Sabbath. The Sabbath was not given to the fathers, and it was given because they had come out of the land of Egypt. And they were commanded to keep it at that time. In Nehemiah 9:13, he says, thou camest down also upon Mount Sinai, and spakest with them from heaven, and gavest them right ordinances and true laws, good statutes and commandments. Now watch this. Verse 14, and madest known unto them thy holy Sabbath. The holy Sabbath was made known unto them at that time. Now what is he saying? He's not saying that they didn't know that God rested, but the Sabbath keeping that they're going to have to do was made known at that time. Commanded them commandments and statutes and law by Moses thy servant. What was made known was the intent that God had that they would keep that Sabbath day and honor it. That was made known at Sinai. And that's what, in accordance with what we learned in the other passages in Deuteronomy 5, and the 2 and 3 in Deuteronomy 5:15, and also in Nehemiah 9 here, 13 and 14. God did not make the Ten Commandment covenant. It's frequently called Decalogue. Deca is 10, Deca, and log, L-O-G-U-E, is a form. That's a British spelling for the word saying. And it's the word that's translated word in John 1:1 and following. It's the 10 sayings or the 10 commandments, see. That's called the Decalogue. In the United States, the UE is dropped off it. With their fathers, Deuteronomy 5:3. So we made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us who, all of us are here alive this day. God did not just remind them of the Sabbath, he revealed it. Thou camest down also upon Mount Sinai and spakest unto them with them from heaven, and gavest them right ordinances and laws, true laws, good statutes, commandments, and madest known unto them thy holy Sabbath at Mount Sinai, see, unto them the commandments, statutes, and the law by Moses thy servant. So it was by Moses that this was done. Sabbath was a time of rest, a day of rest. There was a Sabbath day, a day of rest. There was a Sabbath year in the law of Moses, and even Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, was a day of Sabbath, the day that they had the rest as well. Children of Israel were forbidden to do any work on the Sabbath day. It was perpetual from the time that the law of Moses was binding, or the time the law of Moses was binding. But it ceased to be bound, as we'll see in our next lesson next week. Sabbath was not observed until Mount Sinai, according to the scripture we have here. Are there questions?